For this project, we're going to create a nice scenic animation where we've got some hills and some grass, and the sun actually comes up and washes light over the hills using masking. If we play this, we can see that we even have some nested animation inside of the grass that's in the foreground. So in this project, we're going to learn how to combine a number of different shape creation tools inside of Animate, as well as a number of different animation techniques in order to create these cool scenic animations. Before we start any project, we should take some time to do some proper project planning and design. So let's see what the workflow for a sort of project lifecycle is inside of Adobe Animate. The basic workflow goes like this: plan, design, build, test, and publish. Project planning involves all of these different phases. The goals have to be clearly defined from the beginning, or things could go off the rails. You need to know the project target audience in order to serve their needs. Do some exploration to discover the asset types and the number of assets needed for the project. You're going to need to avoid scope creep by getting everything in writing. Then if anything deviates from that, you can always point back to the agreement. Build and share a design document. This will keep everybody on track. The primary concerns with project planning are the target audience and the client goals. There are some Animate specific concerns to be aware of, though. Animate projects themselves are often best suited to enhancing other content. Consider whether you're dealing with large files, many files, if you need preloaders for the project. How are you going to handle audio and video within your project? Are your image assets best suited to vector or bitmap? If you're using a lot of photographic content, you're going to be using bitmaps. If you're using lots of stylized stuff, things from Illustrator, logos, things like that, that's probably best suited to vector. Lastly, what is your target platform? Are you dealing with mobile, desktop, browser, or a combination of these? Storyboards themselves exist to show the graphical representation of a visual process. So before you go through and actually perform all the animation and take all that time doing that only to perhaps have to tweak it later, you can create a storyboard at first. Storyboards include sequences, layouts, and transition information. They can also include information about timing, which helps when you sort of lay out your project in Animate. If you're doing interactive animation or even just a static interactive, storyboards can also be used to express interactive flow. So before closing, remember to think about your target audience, choosing colors, fonts, and design styles to match their interest. If you're doing stuff for a company, research that company, determine what information needs to be displayed, and draw up basic wireframes or storyboards to plan the structure. Build a project folder that's going to house all your files. It keeps things nice and organized. All right, so getting to the project at hand, right now, because we just created a new ActionScript 3.0 project, its width is 550 by 400. We want to go ahead and change that to 600 for width and 320 for height. We'll also pull down the FPS or frames per second to 15 frames per second. And note that down in our timeline, now our 1 second mark is at frame 15, our 2 second mark is at frame 30, and so on. The last thing I'll do here to our document settings is change the background color from white to black. And let's center this as well. I'm going to actually zoom in a little bit here because I have room to do that. 200% looks pretty good. And now down here, by default, you'll always have a single layer when you create a new document. We have a number of different layers we're going to work on. Actually, 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. So let's go ahead and create 3 additional layers with the new layer button. So now we have our 4 layers. And then we're going to want to rename these layers. So this one at the very bottom is going to be our sky layer. Layer 2 is going to represent the sun. Layer 3 is going to be reserved for hills. And finally, layer 4, we're going to populate with some grass. So you can see the order of layers here. That's exactly what we want. And let's lock all of our layers right now. And we'll unlock each one as we sort of get to it. The last thing we want to check is our snapping options. If I go up to the View menu, we can look down here in Snapping, and we can see that we've got some snap options selected, but others are not. I'm going to actually go to Edit Snapping, because this brings up a nice little dialog where we can easily turn on or off any of the different snapping options that we want. I usually, for most things, like to have all my snapping on, unless I'm just doing freeform drawing. So I'm going to turn on all my snapping options and hit OK. And we have a document that is ready to go. We'll be able to create some scenic animation. With our timeline established and organized with labels and layers and so forth, what we need to do now is go ahead and start drawing out some of our content. All of the content in this particular project is going to be done using the tools within Animate. So the first thing I want to do is work on the sky. So what we're going to do is unlock our sky layer, and then in the Tools panel, choose the Rectangle tool. And here in our Tools property, we can change our fill color to something that looks like a sky. So maybe I'll choose something like that. So a nice blue color. And for stroke, I don't really need any stroke, so I'm going to disable my stroke by selecting the Disable swatch. And rectangle options, 0 corner radius is good. We want a perfect, sharp, cornered rectangle. All right, so what we're going to do is click at the upper left and drag across. And notice that because we did turn on snapping to grid and our snapping options have all been enabled, that the snapping works really quite well. Once we release here, we have our blue sky across our entire stage. Now, this is just a flat blue color. What I actually want to do is create this as a gradient, and a specific type of gradient, which is a linear gradient. So with the selection tool, I'm going to click on our object here. And, here's a nice trick. If you don't want to see this sort of pattern against your shapes, you can always convert your shapes into drawing objects. So right here, create object. And now as a drawing object, I can see what this looks like a lot better. So that's a nice trick if it is obscuring your view at all. So what we want to do here is actually apply a gradient instead of just a solid fill. And the best way to do that is to look within our color panel. So here in the color panel, we have a solid color, and we can see the color selected here. Let's go ahead and switch this out to a linear gradient. There we go. By default, we have 2 stops in our gradient. One is black and the other is white. A linear gradient, of course, just goes from one stop to the next, and we can always add additional stops if we want to by just clicking and adding them. To drag any off, you just kind of remove them by clicking and dragging them off. It's really easy to manipulate your linear gradients. So what we need to do is actually define our colors for both of these stops. If I select each one, we can see that they're represented here. But what I'm going to do is choose a blue, and I want it to be kind of dark blue on one side. And then for the light blue, again, we'll hit this blue color and figure out exactly how we want this blue to look. That's pretty nice. I might make the dark blue a little bluer and just tweak it a bit to make it slightly darker. All right, that's pretty good. So if we want, of course, we can add this to our swatches. So I'm going to click that. And now if we go to our swatches right here, we can see we have our linear gradient added as a swatch. So we can apply that to other things if we want to. Now, looking at the sky here, it's a little weird looking, right? Usually, if you're looking at a gradiated sky, you've got the gradation going from top to bottom or bottom to top. So what we need to do here is transform this gradient. And Animate has a gradient transform tool that allows us to do that. So to switch between them both, we just have to sort of like click and hold, and then we can choose either free transform or gradient transform. So with my gradient transform tool selected, I'm going to click on my object here, and now we can go ahead and do certain things like change the width of our gradient and change the rotation of the gradient as well. We can use this point here to change the center point. I'm going to kind of leave it somewhere around here though. That's looking pretty good. I want the sun to be kind of just rising. So that is a nice looking gradient for our sky right there. Maybe I'll tweak it a little bit more. Yeah, that's pretty good. So with our sky created, I can now lock that layer down so we don't make any mistakes. And the next thing I'm going to draw out is my sun. So I'm going to unlock the sun layer and select it. And just like we created the sky with our rectangle, we're going to create the sun with an oval. So I'm going to choose the oval tool. And for a fill, let's choose a nice sunny orange yellow color. To use the oval tool, I can click and drag to create our oval here. But if I hold down the Shift key, you'll notice that we get a perfect circle as we drag this out. Also, if I hold down the Alt or Option key, it'll actually grow and expand and shrink from the point that I initially clicked instead of from the corner. So I'm gonna make a pretty big sun here. That's okay. You can make it as big as you want. It doesn't really matter that much. Whatever you feel like your sun should look like. And then I'm going to select the sun because we want the sun to also have a bit more dimension to it. So instead of a flat fill, once again, we're going to go to our color panel. And instead of solid color, we're going to choose a gradient. But linear gradients just isn't going to cut it for our sun here. We want to use a radial gradient because with a radial gradient, it sort of shifts out from the middle outwards. And note again, we have this sort of modeled texture to show that it's a shape. If this is obscuring your view, you can always create an object out of that. All right, back into our color panel. What we need to do, it's applied that last gradient that we used. So we just need to go ahead and make some adjustments to that to choose the colors that we really want our sun to look like. So yellows and oranges and so forth. And this is ever so subtle, but it's pretty good. There we go. Well, that's a little too orange. All right, that's pretty good. I'm going to add that to my swatches as well in case we want to use that later on. And finally lock down my sun layer before we create some additional content. All right, there's just a couple of other things we need to create for our animation here. And the next one on our list up from the sun are the hills. So let's go ahead and select that layer and unlock it. So for the hills, what I'm going to choose is to use the pen tool. So using the pen tool, what we're going to do is start drawing out some hills. So to use the pen tool, you just click somewhere. So I'm going to set my initial point on the pasteboard here. So I'm going to click, and now I've got that point right there. So now I need to figure out where I want my secondary anchor point. And I could, of course, just click. And what's that going to do? It's going to make a line for me. But I don't want a line. I actually want a curve. So to make a curve, when you click that second anchor point, hold down your mouse button and pull to the side, and you get these nice little handles that you can use to sort of define that curve. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Click and drag. There's our nice curve. And then to sort of follow through with this curve and end up with a nice hilly structure, I'm going to actually just click and drag right there. And note that if you hold down the Alt or Option key as you're dragging these handles out, you can then break them off like this. So now I can just sort of click and click. And one final click on that initial anchor point is going to actually close the path for us. And that's what we need to do in order to fill this path, is to close it. Notice if I hover over this initial anchor point with the pen tool, my cursor changes to show a closed path. Once I click, the path is now closed. So what we can do to fill this is actually look over here again, and we can find our paint bucket tool. The paint bucket tool allows us to add a fill to a closed path. So here's the fill over in the properties panel under tool settings. And for my hills, I just want something nice and green. I'm going to choose this kind of dark green color and just click anywhere within that closed path. And presto, we've got our little hill now. So we need to clean this up a bit. So what I'm going to do is actually double click on our stroke. I want to remove it. And there are a couple ways to remove the stroke. If you click on specific pieces of the stroke, note that only those specific pieces actually get selected at a time. But if I double click on any of those areas, it's going to select the entire stroke, and I can then hit delete on my keyboard and remove it. Another thing I want to do is have a bit of a duplicate based on the shape. So I'm going to select the shape itself, and I don't want this to interfere with other shapes on this same layer. So I'm going to create a drawing object out of this through the properties panel. And now that it's a drawing object, if I hold down my Alt key or my Option key and click and drag, it automatically creates a duplicate of that shape for me. So what I'm going to do here is actually offset this a bit in the background to make some hills that are further off in the distance. Let's go ahead and look at some of the panels over here. I've got my information panel. I've got my line panel. This one right here is the transform panel. Let's open that up and note that you can do things like rotation, skews, here's some 3D stuff. But you've also got some mirroring options. So we can flip the selection horizontally or vertically. I want to flip this horizontally. So clicking that has flipped my artwork horizontally. I'm now going to go ahead and make that a little darker because it is going to be sort of in the background. So let's see what we can do here. Just make that much darker and hit OK. Perfect. All right. So if I try to overlay this just like that, you'll notice that it's sort of obscuring all the other hill stuff. I really want this hill to be behind this hill. So the way we do that, since they're both on the same layer, is we can select the uppermost hill, so this one that's overlaying everything. And if we right click, choose Arrange, Send Backward. That's going to send it backwards, and it's now behind our other hill. Finally, something we need to do is actually kind of trim this up a little. Now we could leave everything like this and just use the Clip Content outside the stage button to preview how this looks. And it's looking pretty nice. I like it quite a bit. However, I do want to kind of trim off some of this excess a bit. So to do that, since we're dealing with drawing objects, if we double click on the drawing object, we actually enter into the drawing object. You can see from the breadcrumbs up here. And once we do that, we're able to manipulate the shape within. So using the selection tool, I'm going to drag a selection rectangle just around this part of the shape, and notice that only that part gets selected. This allows me to then hit delete and remove it. So I'm going to clean up all the edges here, and I don't want to be too precise because I want things to bleed over a little bit into the pasteboard. But you can see how much nicer and cleaner that looks now. To do it to the other hill, I'm going to go back out to scene 1 through the breadcrumbing and just double click on that hill in the background and perform the same actions with my selection tool. So just dragging across there, hitting delete. And let's trim up the bottom too. Why not? There we go. So again, to go back out, we just go to scene 1. And as a help, and this only affects authoring time really, you can clip the content outside the stage. So you can see exactly how things are gonna look. Nice. Let's go ahead and lock down our hills. And we're ready to move on. Okay, now that we have our hills in position, we need to switch over to the grass layer because we're going to unlock that and draw in some nice tufts of grass that'll populate the foreground here. So to do that, what we're going to do is use the line tool. The line tool can be found in the tools panel right here. It just looks like a little line. And again, I am using the Essentials workspace for this. So if you're using a different workspace, it will look different. Let's go ahead and change our stroke color with our tool properties selected. We're going to change that to a nice green color, a pretty neutral green right now. We can change this later, maybe something like that. And the opacity is going to be 100%. And for stroke size, we can push this up a little bit right now. Now for style, if you look in here, you've got a number of different styles, including some sort of dashed and ragged, stippled, and so forth. We don't want to change styles. However, we do want to apply a width preset or width profile to this. So using this drop down here, we can find this little width profile one, and you can see how each of these differ quite a bit from just the normal profile. So let's choose width profile 1. And that looks very much like a leaf, right? We could make some leafy shapes out of that, including blades of grass. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can go ahead and we can draw this wherever we want. We'll reposition things later on. I'm going to click and drag with my line tool until I've got a nice little tuft of grass, just like that. Now, switching over to our selection tool and then selecting that grass, we can see here that all of those things we just chose can actually be modified. So I can change my stroke size, and you can see how the actual shape changes based on that. We can change the color. We've got position and size now. And one thing that's really important here is we want to make sure that these are drawing objects that we're creating because we don't want them to conflict with one another. So I'm going to make this into a drawing object by clicking right there. And that's now a drawing object. It still functions the same. It's just that it's protected inside of that box. Note that we can also change our width profile here. And there is an additional way to change width profiles, and that is with the width tool. However, like a lot of tools inside of Animate, that is not a default tool to show up. So what I'm going to do is click on the ellipse to edit my toolbar. And we can locate right here our width tool. So pulling that over, maybe I'll just even kind of group that in with the line tool. There we go. And now that I've got the width tool selected, I can go ahead and notice as I sort of run my cursor along the length of my line that we get a little dot here. This allows me to click and drag to pull out an additional width point. However, we already have a width point right here. And if I hover over that, I can then reposition the width point. So if I want my blade of grass to have sort of a fatter end on one end, I can move that width point down there. And I can even click on these handles that come out to change the actual width, just like that. So that looks like a pretty good little blade of grass there. Maybe I'll pull it down a little bit more and make some further adjustments to this. But otherwise, that's pretty good. So now that I have this blade of grass, if I go back over to my selection tool and select the blade once again, you'll notice that we have a variable width profile that is a custom variable width profile. So it's unlike any of the presets. What I can do is click on the little ellipse right here for my width profile options, and I can add this to my profiles. This is going to save this as a new custom width profile. We can give it a name. I'm going to call this grass blade and hit OK. So now if we go through and look, there's our grass blade. Any custom width presets are going to show up at the bottom of this dropdown, and we can have multiples if we want. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's use the line tool once again to create some more blades of grass. So if you recall, I grouped my width tool with my line tool. So going back to the line tool here, I can now just drag out a couple more blades of grass at varying lengths. Oops. So you see what happened right there is because I forgot to actually have my blades of grass be drawn as drawing objects like my original. I've got like this mess of shape data here. So let's actually start that over. And it's actually good that we did that just so we can see the differences between the different object drawing modes here. So what I should have done when I selected the line tool was if you look up here, you can turn object drawing mode on or off. I'm going to turn it on. It gets a blue light around it. And now if I go ahead and drag out these new grass blades, we can see that they're not going to overlap. They're actually going to be precise little grass blades. That works a lot better. Now, something else I can do is, of course, with the selection tool, select each one. And I can see that definitely they are individual drawing objects. Let's go ahead and make some adjustments, though. I am going to pull down my stroke size on some of these because I don't really want them to be as thick as they are. I want them to be a little bit varied from one another, especially some of these smaller ones. And I'm going to do this until I get something that looks like the kind of grass, a realistic clump of grass. Another thing we can do is going through, we can select a couple of these by holding Shift and clicking them. And then we can change the actual color on the selected bits. I'm actually going to use my color wheel for that because I just want to modify it just a slight bit. I don't want it to be too variable. Right now that is a bit too variable. Let's grab a couple more of these and keep making these adjustments. That's looking a little better. Now, any of your lines, if you want, you can always use the free transform tool to sort of rotate and reposition them like this. All right, I think that's actually pretty good. The last thing I'll do is select this one toward the back here, right click and choose Arrange, Send to Back. That way it'll be way behind everything else. And that looks pretty good. So the last thing that we need to do is actually convert this into a movie clip symbol so that we can reuse it across our little animation here. So to do that, using the selection tool, I'm going to draw a selection rectangle around the entire bundle of grass here, and then choose Modify, Convert to Symbol. This brings up the Convert to Symbol dialog. I'm going to call this Grass Bundle. And we're going to set the registration point to the bottom. And that way, the registration point is going to be set right here where you would expect the root system to originate from. This is going to be important in the next video, so make sure you do that. When finished, hit OK. And with that, we're pretty much ready to move on. All right, so we have our little grass bundle here, and it is a movie clip symbol instance, an instance of grass bundle. If we look inside of our library, we can see the grass bundle actually shows up right here. You can't see it right now because we have this option to clip the content outside the stage turned on. If I turn that back and then we go in, now we can see what it looks like. It's just a little glitch that happens when you have this enabled, but don't worry about it too much. If it happens to you, that's how you fix it. Anyhow, let's actually edit this grass bundle in place because what we want to do now is to create some nested animation where these little leaves of grass just sort of sway back and forth a little bit in the breeze. So to edit in place, we simply double click upon the instance on the stage. So I'm going to double click. And immediately you notice a couple things have changed. The background is all grayed out, it's all disabled because we're no longer in that timeline. However, we can edit and still retain the sort of awareness of the position of our different elements on the timeline itself. Down here, we have a single layer, and every one of these little grass pieces is on that single layer. What we want to do, because when we animate inside of Adobe Animate, we want to make sure every piece of animated content exists on its own individual layer. So since these are already selected, we don't necessarily need to select them again, but let's say that they weren't. You can always use the selection tool and just draw a selection rectangle around there, and then they're selected once again. You'll also notice that we're now inside of the grass bundle movie clip symbol. And here is scene 1, which is our main timeline. So to go back out to scene 1, all we have to do is click scene 1 right there. If we want to go back into the timeline for this movie clip symbol, just double click on it again, and we're back inside. So the first thing you might notice is the registration point, even though we set things up so that it was on the bottom center, it's a little bit off from the actual bottom center of our little bundle here. So since these are all selected, I can actually use the arrow keys on my keyboard to just sort of reposition that so it kind of makes more sense. It's not necessary, but if we can fix it and make things more organized, it's always helpful for ourselves. All right, so what we need to do is distribute all of these different little shapes to their own layers. So to do that, with them all selected in this manner, if we right click, we can choose Distribute to Layers. Once that's selected, you'll see that each one of these blades of grass is now going to exist on its own little layer. I'm going to pull up our timeline a bit so we can see that and recenter the stage. And there's really no need to rename all of these because we know that they're all blades of grass. All right, first thing we want to do is extend our actual frames in the timeline all the way to frame 30 at the 2-second marker. Right now we only have a single frame, and if we try to scrub, nothing happens because we only have that single frame. To create animation, you need at least 2 frames. To select all these frames, we can actually click and drag down across frame 30 to select all those frames across every layer. And then up above here, where you see Insert Keyframe, if you hold down on there, what we want to do is select Frame. That's going to extend our frame span to frame 30, and now we can actually scrub that playhead back and forth. We're one step closer to creating some sort of animation here. Notice that you can also, if you're unfamiliar with this option, you can always hit F5 on your keyboard to insert frames, or you can go up to the Insert menu, Timeline, and you can choose from different frame types here. So there's a number of different ways to do it. What we want to do now is insert a couple of keyframes. So we want this to keep looping. So on frame 30, let's go ahead and select all those frames again, just click and drag. This time we actually do want to insert a keyframe here. So we want to make this last frame into a keyframe. There we go. That's going to preserve the properties of these. They're going to be exactly the same at frame 30 as they are at frame 1. And we're going to do the same thing on frame 15, which is the center of our animation, the middle part. We're going to add or insert keyframes across all those layers as well. All right, so we've got these different changes now. And the only thing we need to do is to modify kind of how we want this to look. So I'm going to select all of these objects and then zoom in a little bit more. So 200%, let's actually go to like 400%. There we go. We can see it nice and big now. All right, so make sure you're on frame 15 with those keyframes in the middle there. And also ensure that you don't have anything selected with the selection tool. So to do that, you can always like click off of here and you can see from the properties panel, we don't actually have anything selected because we can only access the document properties. The selection tool can not only select things, but it can also be used to modify things. If you hover over anything that can be modified, you'll notice that the cursor turns into like a little arc down at the bottom. That means that we can click and drag to actually modify how our shape is. So what we're going to do is just kind of click and drag these over just a little bit, tiniest bit, so that it looks like they're just kind of moving in the breeze slightly. To see the difference here, we can scrub the playhead. Let's deselect everything. There we go. So it's super slight. And you can, of course, play with this until it's exactly like you want it. So to actually sort of fill in all the different movements between these different keyframes, we're going to just drag a selection rectangle down here. Just click and drag across all these different frames. So you should have just a bunch of frames selected across every layer that goes into each frame span between all these keyframes. From here, you can choose to right click and look at that. We can create a motion tween, a classic tween, or even a shape tween. Now these are simple shapes. So we're gonna wanna choose create shape tween here. However, there's actually a new little widget up here inside Animate 2020 that'll let us create tweens directly in the timeline. So I'm gonna hold down my key here and look, there's the same exact options. So I'm gonna now choose create shape tween. And there we go. Now we have a shape tween created between all these different keyframes. And if I go ahead and play this back, we can see it's super slight, but we do have a little bit of motion here going on. And it looks like just a nice soft breeze is kind of moving these things. All right, let's go back to the main timeline. So once again, we're going to hit scene 1 right up here, and we're in the main timeline. And here's our grass. And notice the main timeline only has that single frame right now. So if we go back to like 200% and center once again, we don't need this much timeline exposed. There we go. So I can go and position this somewhere else. Let's just pop it somewhere down there. It looks a little more realistic. Even though we only have that single frame, because we're actually using a movie clip symbol right here, a movie clip symbol's timeline is not bound to the main timeline. So even though there's one single frame on the main timeline, the movie clip symbol timeline, if you recall, has 30 frames. And because it's a movie clip symbol, that's going to exist on this single frame, but it's going to loop internally. So if we go ahead and test this by hitting the test movie button up here, or choosing Control Test, what we're going to see is even though we're on that single frame, we can see that little bundle of grass just ever so slightly shifting in the breeze. All right, so right now we only have this very single solitary clump of grass that's sitting here in our grass layer, and it is a movie clip symbol instance of a movie clip symbol named grass bundle. So the difference between an instance of a symbol and the symbol itself is that instances of the symbol appear on the stage, whereas if you go to the library, as mentioned before, you have the actual symbol itself in the library. Let's go back to our properties. And what we're going to do is actually turn off our clip content outside the stage and go to maybe not 100%, but maybe like 130% so that we can start looking at the big picture here. So what I'm going to do is just kind of reposition this piece of grass over here. And one way to duplicate content inside of Animate is to hold down the Alt or Option key and then click and drag. And what you'll basically do is drag out new instances of that same symbol. So here we have our grass bundle symbol again. These are all instances of grass bundle. You can also go into your library, and with grass bundle selected, you can just drag new instances directly onto the stage. It does the same exact thing. It's just two different ways of doing it. And this is a good way to illustrate how this in the library is the symbol itself, whereas these little fellows on the stage are the symbol instances. So they all share a connection and retain a connection to the symbol in the library. Make any changes within the symbol's timeline, and those instances on the stage are going to adapt to match the symbol changes. However, if you go ahead and actually modify things like scale or rotation or position or even color effects to instances on the stage, that actually will only apply to the instance. So let's have a look at that. We need to add some variance to all of these things. So the first thing we're going to do is actually try to reposition these. And let's use the free transform tool to do this, because that's going to allow us to do things like rotate and scale our different pieces of grass, as well as reposition them. So I want like a big clump of grass over here. And let's make it a little thinner in this case. And we're just adding some variance to this, right? We can have them overlap if we want to. And pull out one down here. And let's make this one a little smaller. And another thing we can do is if we select one of these and look over here into our object properties, we've got color effects. Right now, there are no color effects applied. However, we can always adjust something like the brightness. So if I pull the brightness down on this, you can see the brightness of that particular instance changes compared to some of the other instances here. I think I'm going to do the same thing to this one. Just pull that brightness down a bit. So it's a little different. Over in our other corner, let's go ahead and sort of pull some of these together as well. And we'll make a mirror transform here. We'll just flip that using, once again, just the free transform tool. And you know what? I want one more of these guys. So I'm going to go into the library and pull that out somewhere around here. Just make it kind of big and just have it off, like way off to the bottom here, so that we just see a little bit of what's going on. What we've done is actually made a lot of different changes to these instances, but any one of these, if we still select it, we can see it's still an instance of grass bundle. Every single one of these shares that connection. So what I'm going to do is actually go into the library here and note that the symbol itself exists there. Even if we go into any of these symbol instances, so if I double click on one of these, we're now editing the symbol itself, even though we can see it sort of in relation to how that instance exists on the stage. If I make any changes to the timeline right here, so if I add a layer and maybe just use the brush to just kind of make a little squiggle, notice that a squiggle appears above every one of these additional instances. And the reason for that is, of course, because each one of these is still sharing all of those different internal aspects with the symbol itself. So to get rid of that, I can go inside and simply delete that squiggle there, and it's removed from every single instance. All right, let's go ahead and test this and see how it looks. As you can see, each one of those little leaves is blowing in the breeze, and they're sort of interacting with each other, and it looks pretty nice. That's a nice little scene right there. And this is all still a single frame of animation on the main timeline. The only animation taking place is nested within our grass bundle symbol. All right, with our grass created, let's go ahead and lock the grass layer. And what we need to do now is animate the sunrise. So let's unlock the sun layer and make a selection on the sun itself. Now, if we look in the properties panel, we can see that this is now a drawing object, or it could be a shape depending upon how you actually created this. We have our nice gradient fill here. However, I want this to be a movie clip symbol. And the reason that I want that is because there's a lot more stuff we can do to a movie clip symbol than we can do to a simple shape or drawing object, such as apply different effects and filters to it. So with the sun selected, I'm going to go ahead and choose Modify, Convert to Symbol. Here we want a movie clip symbol, and let's move the registration point to the center since the sun is a disk. And what we'll do is name this sun and hit OK. All right. So if we look inside the library, now the sun is in the library as well as the grass bundle. And again, if you're clipping stuff to the stage, let's undo that. Your preview will screw up here. So you want to make sure that if you're trying to preview these things, that this option is deselected. Back to properties. And look at that. We've got all sorts of stuff in here now, like color effects. We have blend modes. We have filters. We have 3D position and view, vanishing point, accessibility, whole bunch of stuff. So what we want to actually do to the sun before we do anything else is to add a nice glow filter to this to represent the sunlight. So when we do this, let's just move the sun out to the center here so that we can see it really good. And I'm going to just kind of collapse some of these because we want to focus on filters. To add a filter to a movie clip symbol instance, we just click the Add Filter button and we choose the type of filter we want to add. I want to add a simple glow filter here. And right now that filter is red. If we change the blur X and blur Y properties, let's lock those together so they both increase or decrease at the same time. We can see how that glow filter is applied here. And let's really bump that up. Let's go to like 200 or so, 255, whatever. That's fine. So there's some other options here, like to only do inner glow, to knock out, which will remove the original object. You'll only have the effect. And we can adjust the strength here. So if the strength is a bit too much, you can pull that down. I'm going to keep it at like 85%. And for the shadow, it says shadow color here, but it's obviously a glow filter. This probably should be glow color. Take note, Adobe. All right, so let's click on the color. And what we'll do is actually sample from the sun itself. So somewhere in the middle there, we'll sample that color. We can play with the strength a little bit more. Pull that up, take it down. However intense we want the sunlight to be. That's pretty good. We don't want it to be crazy, but yeah, 80, somewhere between 80, 90, 94%. That's great. Okay, so that's our glow filter. And note that you can add additional filters and they do stack. And there is a layer order to them and how they're applied. Very similar if you've ever used After Effects. So now we have our glow filter. Let's go ahead and actually animate this thing. Before we animate it, we're going to have to add some frames to this animation. So let's go out to around frame 75 because that is the 5-second mark. And here we're just going to click and drag to highlight all the frames across every layer and then choose to insert frames up to that point by selecting frame from this dropdown. At this point, we can then scrub our playhead. That's great. And way at the beginning here, what we need to do is figure out where we want the sun to start. If the sun is rising, we need it to start below the hills here. So for this, I'm going to actually go out to 100%. And just on that first keyframe, just grab the sun and move it way down here until we can't even really see the glow peeking up above the hills. Now, what I want to do is create a motion tween here. So we can do that in the same way we created shape tweens before. So you can always right click and choose create motion tween, or you also have the ability to go ahead and create a motion tween from there as well. That went a little fast. So let's undo that. There's a slip of the stylus here. So here we have create classic tween or motion tween. Classic tweens work the same as shape tweens do, except they're used upon symbol instances. Motion tweens are a little bit different, and if you click on that, it's now applied to our layer. You can see inside of the layer, we've got this little symbol that signifies a motion tween right here. So motion tweens work differently from shape tweens and classic tweens in that they actually, you can sort of manually set keyframes, but you can also just move the playhead somewhere. So I'm moving the playhead to frame 60 here. And then without even setting a manual keyframe, I can then move my sun up to whatever the position is where I want it to sort of hold. So let's have it end up right there. So a number of things have happened. We get an automatic keyframe, and these only work with motion tweens. Automatic keyframe, and we also have this really cool representation of its path from one keyframe to the next. And as we scrub this, we can see it go up and down. Now, if I hit play here, you can see the sun comes up in a very linear fashion. To fix that, we can actually add an ease to this. So if I click anywhere on this motion tween, note that in the properties panel for our frame, we have the ability to ease, and a negative ease is an ease in. If we pull this all the way to negative 100, we can see that there's way more little dots down here than they are right here. They're spaced farther apart. Each one of these dots is actually representative of one of the frames in our timeline. So what this is showing us is that the motion is going to correspond to a bunch of frames down here and less frames up here. And that's going to give us a nice ease in. If I switch this to a positive number, so positive 100, you can see they're bunched up on this side, spaced out more on that side, and that makes an ease out. So let's kind of go back here and play. And you can see that's a bit different now. It's got a nice ease to it. There's one more way of actually creating eases inside of Motion Tweens, and that is to use what's called the motion editor. So to get to the motion editor, and again, this is very specific to Motion Tweens, it only works with them. If I double click on the Motion Tween, there we go, there's our editor. So down here, you'll notice we have an X and Y position for location, and we also have the ability to apply eases for our properties. So if I choose location, and right now we're using a simple slow ease. If I click this, there is a bunch of additional ease types here. We can choose fast, medium, slow, and so forth. So let's go ahead and we're just going to do a simple medium ease. Double click and it's applied. To actually close out this particular motion editor, all we need to do is double click it once again, and then it's back to where it was. Let's go ahead and clip the contents to the stage and go into like 180% again. And there's one more thing we want to do. And that is right now, this guy comes in and guess what? It's going in a straight line. What if we wanted to have this sort of curve and an arc? Because the sun does not travel in a straight line, right? It has like a curve to it. So we've got this motion guide here. Notice that I can hold my cursor over the motion guide and we get that little arc. That means I can click and drag to actually reposition the path of the sun. So figure out exactly how you want it to work. It can be as subtle or as intense as you like. I'm going to keep it at something like that. All right, with that done, let's go ahead and actually test this. All right, that's pretty good. Okay, the last thing we really need to do here, as the sun rises, you would expect some of this sunlight to fall against the hills and lighten them up a bit. So what we'll do is actually lock our sun layer. We're done with that. But we want to duplicate our hills layer and then use a mask to sort of reveal lighter versions of our hills. So to do this, I need to duplicate the entire layer with both sets of hills. So I'm going to right click and let's see. There should be a duplicate layers option and there it is. So once I click duplicate layers, notice we have hills copy and I'm going to rename this to hills lighten. This is a lighter version of our hills. Okay, so let's unlock the lighter versions of our hills and we're going to start lightening these up a bit. I'm going to choose the hills that are towards the back here and inside of the fill color, I'm going to go into my color chooser and let's just lighten that up a bit. There we go. And the same thing with the hills in the foreground. Go into the fill, change the color just to lighten it up about the same amount as we did the hills in the back. Okay, so now that we've done that, if I toggle my visibility here, we can see that we've got our dark hills and then we've got our light hills. So what we want to do is have a mask just sort of wash over all these hills as the sun emerges. So let's figure out where that sun starts out. Starts popping out right about there and probably here thereabouts. Maybe we'll go to frame 20 to keep it nice and even. This is where we're actually gonna start lightening things up and that light is gonna spread across our hills as the sun rises. So to do this, we actually need to create a new layer right above the hills layer or hills lighten layer. So we're gonna create a new layer. I'm gonna call this hills mask. And it's not a mask just yet. To make it a mask, we'll do that shortly. But what we need to do is actually go in here and let's go right here And I want to choose my oval tool, because this is going to be an oval. And here I want no stroke, and I want my fill to just be this like weird green color. This is what I often use for things like masks and guides and things of that nature, because it's such an unnatural color. All right, so from here, we need to figure out where we're gonna start doing this. So I think we're gonna start right here where the hills kind of meet. So right there. And we're gonna start with it just right there. And notice that we're starting it on frame 1. So figuring out at frame 20, what we're gonna do is actually animate the mask itself and not the layers beneath it. We're gonna have to add some keyframes here. So at frame 20 on the hills mask layer, I'm gonna insert a keyframe right there. And then let's figure out where we want it to stop. Probably somewhere around there. Well, maybe 40. We're gonna have it go pretty quick. I'm gonna add another keyframe right there as the sun is up above the hills at this point. At frame 40, let's use our free transform tool and figure out how we want this to actually look. I'm going to pull that across everything. You can see it's super, super big. So we're going from this little dot here to that, right? That is our mask. It's covering all the hills. Let's go ahead now and choose any of the frames between these two keyframes in your hills underscore mask layer. And what we're going to do is not create a motion tween, but since we're dealing with a shape mask, we're going to create a shape tween. We could preview that, of course. There we go. And now we just need to make it into an actual mask layer. There's a number of different ways to do that. One of those ways is to just right click on hills underscore mask and choose mask. There we go. So what this has actually done is it's created this layer as a mask layer, and then the layer directly below it, which contains the light versions of the hills, it has nested that underneath the mask layer, and it's in essence a masked layer at this point. If we right click on the mask layer itself and go to properties, we can see right there that this is a mask layer. If we do the same thing to hills lighten, properties, we can see this is a masked layer. So now that we've got that all set, if we go back and play, neat. So we can see the sunlight just sort of spread out from that position and reveal the differently colored hills beneath, lightening them up significantly. So a couple more things about masks. If we go ahead and unlock either the mask or the masked layer, either one, it's going to break the mask effect in our authoring environment. However, it's not going to break that effect when we're actually publishing this. Another thing we could do here, even though it starts there, notice the sun's already like over here at this point. We probably want to move that masked object, so this guy here, over so its center point is underneath the sun itself. Let's lock that again and have a look. There we go. Now that's pretty good. All right, let's go ahead and test it, and then we'll call it done. Here it goes. Beautiful. With our animation completed, let's talk about some different publish and export options that we can do here. Now, we're using ActionScript 3 as a file type, which gives us some interesting ways of doing this. Of course, if we go under our publish settings, under document properties, we can choose more settings here. Note that you can also go ahead and export it as a GIF image, and that can be an animated GIF. You can use JPEG, PNG images, all these different types here. But the one that I really want to mention is Swift Archive. So what Swift Archive is going to do is if this is selected, You give it an output name, and it's going to create a zip file. And that zip file is going to include every single layer that you created as an individual SWF. Why is that good? Well, it's going to allow you to bring those SWF files into something like Adobe After Effects and do some further compositing upon them. One of the workflows that is heavily used in television production for animation is that people create things using the ActionScript 3 document type inside of Animate, and then they bring that into After Effects in order to do further compositing upon their animation. So that is one option. However, there's a better way to do that. If you actually have both After Effects, you can just click and drag your animate file right into your project bin. And you can see that After Effects is going to try to interpret these items from your specific FLA file from the project we just created. And we can even import audio if it exists. We don't have any audio in our project right now. So let's hit OK. So what happens here is it's going to create a project folder which contains all of the different layers that we had in our timeline. We can see here is grass. And if you look, let's kind of widen this a little bit so we can see it better. We'll see this as we go through. But we have our grass layer here, which is in the foreground. Then this happens to be our, let's pull that over, hills lighten. There's our hills. There's the sun. And finally, our sky layer. Apart from bringing each of these individual layers in here, allowing us to treat them as individual layers in our composition, it also creates for us an entire composition based on our document. So if I double click on this comp, we enter into the comp right here, and here are all of our preserved layers from Animate. Notice as well that we also have all of our masking. It's all working. The glow from the sun, the masking, all that stuff is functional. The only thing in this case that doesn't come across are the nested animation in our leaves, unfortunately. But that is also something we could apply some stuff inside of After Effects to accomplish.